Hey everyone, and welcome back. Or if you're new here, hi, I'm Mackenzie, aka Astromac, and I'm a professional astrologer, and I talk all things astrology on this channel. And today we are diving into all things Scorpio, that sign that is all about depth and intensity and power and emotional alchemy. And I think Scorpio is probably one of the more misunderstood signs, if not the most misunderstood. It can be kind of polarizing where people either love them or they hate them. They love to talk about them though, that's one of Scorpio's gifts. They've kind of been able to dig their way into everybody's psyche in some way. Either way, people can't seem to stop talking about Scorpio. And so if you've been following my Zodiac series for a while, then you know that each sign is kind of like its own universe, and there's so much depth to each and every sign, but Scorpio is that sign that pretty much goes the deepest. So if you want to understand Scorpio energy coming from a Scorpio, Venus, and Jupiter myself, then this is your Scorpio 101 video. So Scorpio is the 8th sign of the zodiac, following the harmonizing and relationship-oriented Libra. And in Scorpio, this is where we take these Libra lessons and take them even deeper. Scorpio is the part of the zodiac wheel where we need a bit more intensity and a bit more mystery and a lot more depth. It's where we discover this desire for an intense emotional involvement or entanglement with someone or something apart from ourselves. And so it's where we're learning lessons in intimacy and psychology and trust and power and like those power dynamics and also strength and the strength that's needed in order to be vulnerable. And so Scorpio can be a very intense and extreme sign. And so in Scorpio, that's where those relationships that were established in Libra, they start to deepen. And what happens when our relationships start to deepen? Things feel more exciting and passionate, but on the same coin, it can feel more intense and intimidating and sometimes even a little bit scary. But think about when you're putting your trust in another person, how kind of scary and risky that can feel sometimes. But, there's also a tremendous amount of power and healing and transformation that happens when you can do so. And that is the power of Scorpio. And so whether you have these Scorpio placements or not, you still have Scorpio somewhere in your chart. And so you have Scorpio energy somewhere within you. And so everyone has every single sign in their chart. So just keep that in mind. And so as an archetype, Scorpio is the alchemist and the mystic and the sorcerer, the magician, and it's also the detective and the psychologist. It's this energy that is able to strip away the facade or strip away what's just on the surface, and it's able to dig beneath the surface and reveal the hidden, sometimes deeper and darker truths. It's this energy that really sees through the mask, and it can see right to the core of any given situation and even right through people, almost like they have this laser-like X-ray vision. And it's because they want to know what's really going on underneath the surface of all situations. So Scorpio is this energy that isn't afraid to go there. It's not afraid to go into the deep and the dark and the intense and the messy emotions of life. And it really kind of leans into the transformation and the soul stripping truth that most people would rather not have to deal with and they kind of would rather avoid. I think that's why Scorpio is so strongly associated with the taboo things in life, or even the mysteries and the occult. Where Libra would prefer to keep things balanced and harmonious and diplomatic, Scorpio isn't afraid of rocking the boat. And Scorpio would even go underneath the boat and tip it over if that's something that needs to happen. And they have the power to rock the boat even just by thinking about it. They don't have to put any amount of effort in really, because it's just this power that radiates out of them, and it's just a part of who they are. So Scorpio is this sign that's all about death and rebirth and power and surrender and control and release. Like I said, it's a very extreme sign, but when I say death, it doesn't necessarily mean physical death, although sometimes it can be, but it's more a symbolic or a cyclical, death and rebirth. Or even those psychological deaths, where we kind of release old habits that, no longer serve us, or those old selfish attitudes kind of die. And it's those necessary changes that have to happen before we're able to kind of merge and kind of entangle ourselves with another. And so I always think of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly or a snake shedding its skin when I think of Scorpio energy. because it's this energy of like letting go of those things that no longer serve you, and it's like you're letting go and letting things die in order to grow and evolve and transform. And that is Scorpio energy. The key is in actually releasing those things and letting those things go and releasing those necessary things in order to kind of let those things die, which is not very easy for Scorpio because it takes a lot of time for them to develop these like deep bonds and develop a sense of trust in whatever it might be. And so when it's time to let something die and let something go, it can feel kind of scary for Scorpio because keep in mind Scorpio is a water sign, and so it's a very sensitive sign, and they feel things very deeply, and so they feel that sense of loss, even if they know that it's bad for them, like they feel that sense of loss very deeply. There's a lot of power though when you can trust this process and like trust in this cycle of life and death. Like I can imagine it's probably a very scary process for the caterpillar to turn into a butterfly, but imagine if the caterpillar stayed a caterpillar for the rest of its life, it wouldn't be able to experience life at its full capacity. So try not to resist the Scorpio transformation wherever you have Scorpio in your chart, because the more you resist, the more uncomfortable it can feel. And because Scorpio probably has gone through, multiple transformative events in the course of its life, it creates a profound emotional depth that is truly like none other. So they have like a really profound grit and strength and sense of resilience because of that. And so it's a sign that is really able to overcome all kinds of adversities that life tends to throw at them. And so they're able to like really push past boundaries, and it creates a profound resilience. And when they can use this power to kind of like for, the betterment of themselves as well as the betterment of society, they can really help others in that way, whether it's being like through healing or kind of leading through example and their own kind of transformation. And they create these profound waves of change and evolution wherever they go. So it's like when a Scorpio enters a room, everybody feels it because the energy shifts and it's like something changes because, Scorpio doesn't want to just like dig deep in order to understand life. It wants to transform through every experience that they have in order to create a deeper meaning in life. And so Scorpios usually don't incarnate to have these like easy, breezy, superficial lives. And so after like the graceful and harmonious and beautifying and recalibration that we go through during Libra season, it's like Scorpio season comes in like a really powerful wave, sometimes knocking us over, but it's really like plunging us deep into those waters after a period of like airy, lighthearted tranquility. Because in Libra season, we were being invited to go out and make these social connections and collaborate with others and harmonize the internal with the external world and, just learn how to play nice with others, basically. But now in Scorpio, it's like we're being asked to take what we learned through Libra season and, what we learned about our relationships and, take it even deeper and, not just like a little bit deeper, but a lot of it deeper. So Scorpio season tends to be a time where we just feel a little more like introspective and reflective. Maybe do some like psychoanalyzing and get in touch with like our shadows because it's really a time where we're being asked to be emotionally honest with ourselves and really confront some hard truths sometimes that, may have been swept under the rug during Libra season or whatever. And so as we are kind of like psychoanalyzing ourselves, it can be intense, but it is a good time to really befriend our shadows and learn to integrate our shadows and really integrate those qualities, because there's a lot of power that happens when we can learn to accept even those shadowy qualities of ourselves. Because Scorpio is this sign that doesn't tend to shy away from like, the dark and the deep and the intense and, sometimes the spooky, scary, and dangerous aspects of life. It's actually this energy of like, shining a light in every dark, spooky corner, and it's like, turning over every single stone just to see what's underneath it, and it's like, opening every door just to, see what's inside. So like when you apply that to like your psychoanalyzing, shadows can't hide in the light. And so that's kind of like the energy of Scorpio. So this is a sign that's associated with alchemy and transformation. And so it's a time where we tend to face and then try to heal some of those old wounds, or, including things that, we may have been suppressing or trying to keep a secret either from ourselves or from others. And so it's a time of like emotional archaeology where it's like we're digging up those things that we may have buried, or, those things that we've been trying to keep hidden or keep a secret, So if we go back to my plant analogy, like if you've been following me since my Aries 101 video, then you'll know that like, if Aries is that seedling that's sprouting out of the ground and it's that first sign of life, and then in Taurus, that's where we're kind of, anchoring down and deepening our roots in order to take in the nutrients necessary. And then in Gemini, it's like we're leafing out and we're exploring and we're, inviting in the pollinators. And then in Cancer, we're going back within and we're nurturing our internal growth. And then in Leo, it's that same plant that's back up above ground, and it's blooming and flowering, and it's kind of like seeking attention in order to attract in the pollinators. And then, it's like that sunflower. But then in Virgo, it's that same plant beginning to perfect itself by, producing seeds or fruit, or, you could also think of it as like that plant being harvested, and what's useful gets harvested and what's not useful goes back in the dirt. And then in Libra, that's where, it introduces like this like ecosystem kind of quality where it's like, learning how to work well with the other plants around them and learning how to interact with that ecosystem and operate cooperatively, with others. And now in Scorpio, this is where it invites that transformation and depth in this plant life. It's really about this like deep transformation and almost like this death and rebirth, and really strengthening like the core energy. And so the plant may be losing some leaves or some petals, but the energy really goes inward for the future of the plant. And I always think about Scorpio season as that time of year where like, all the leaves are changing colors and just how beautiful and vibrant they are. But, what's actually happening is the tree and the plants are pulling all of their energy inward. And so it's like, the leaves are actually dying, and that's why they're changing colors. And, it's kind of like a transformation in a way. And so after this change happens, then, the leaves fall to the ground, and it's not like those leaves get wasted, because then those leaves provide the nutrients needed in order for, the plant or the tree to, absorb nutrients again and kind of, take in that fuel. And so it's like these leaves provide like the fertilizer and the nutrients again. They get absorbed back into the tree in some way in order to, keep growing strong and continue its life journey. And I feel like that is such a like life and death and rebirth cycle that is associated with Scorpio. And Scorpio is incredibly resourceful as well, and so it takes advantage of like any kind of resources that it can, even if it's dead leaves. And so Scorpio season is a time of change, and there's a death of sorts that happens during Scorpio season, but it's using that death to kind of fuel the rest of your journey forward for the remainder of the year. And so, like I said, like those trees being used as like the fertilizer is like such a Scorpio thing. And like fertilizer is very Scorpio, like, taking the shit in order to help you grow later down the line. And, you could also think of like composting, but like both of those things, it's like the alchemy in Scorpio. And so it's kind of like it's taking one thing and using it as fuel and turning it into another. That is Scorpio. So in Scorpio, it's where we take like the hard shit we've gone through in life and all of the experiences, and we alchemize it, and we turn our pain into our purpose, or our mess into our message. And that's the alchemy. And so it's like Scorpio really alchemizes through every experience, and they really transform from every experience, and they turn it into like a new understanding of the world around them. It's kind of like every experience changes them in some way, and they are deeply impacted by all of their experiences, especially experiences pertaining to, relationships or entanglements with other people. Because remember, Scorpio is that deepening of those relational bonds. And so in Scorpio, it's where we find a deeper meaning, because, nothing is surface level in Scorpio. And so remember, in Libra, that's where we were seeking partnership in order to create a sense of harmony in our lives. And now in Scorpio, we have this established connection, but now Scorpio is kind of asking like, what lies beneath that connection. And so this is where we dive into that emotional depth and where we kind of enter that realm of intimacy and transformation through our relationships. And so Scorpio really invites us to, face our fears and merge with others. Like that's that merging quality in Scorpio, like two become one kind of energy. It's also where we're being invited to shed those old versions of ourselves so that something newer and truer can be reborn. Because remember, no one ever stays the same throughout the course of their entire life. And so that transformation and that, shedding, like the snake shedding its skin, we're releasing those things that no longer serve us. And, that is the alchemy of the soul. And with alchemy and transformation, we kind of have to face some messy and sometimes difficult things sometimes. So similar to how Librans rarely live very peaceful, harmonious lives, Scorpios very rarely live very easy lives. There tends to be a certain level of loss and grief and suffering that Scorpio placements tend to go through, but it's in order to tap into their innate abilities to transform through chaos and transform through grief and transform through crisis, really. And they have this wonderful ability to be able to transform, deep pain into a deeper meaning in their life. Again, think back to the caterpillar turning into the butterfly, when it's in that chrysalis and in that cocoon state, the caterpillar probably thinks that it's dying because it's turning into this goo and it's dark and it's scary and its skin is being peeled back. And so, this is a crisis if you're a caterpillar, But the caterpillar doesn't resist this transformation, as, scary as it might feel, it just keeps going. And then eventually it wakes up one day and it's time to emerge out of that cocoon. And once it emerges, it's the butterfly. And that starts the beginning of a new life for this caterpillar/butterfly. And that is the Scorpio life and death. And so Scorpio is here to kind of help us embrace these little deaths that happen, on a daily basis, if you have Scorpio in your 6th house like me, but it also teaches us that everyone and everything has its own season where it blooms and it blossoms and then it thrives, and then also a season where it's kind of flop season where you feel like you're dying a little bit. And so Scorpio really helps teach us how to embrace the life and the death and the rebirth cycle, and really kind of embrace that transformation that happens with a sense of courage. So Scorpio tends to be associated with the darker, more spooky and more mysterious aspects of life because death and rebirth are not these live, laugh, love things, And I think with Scorpio above all signs, it comes to this keen awareness of death and mortality. And so Scorpio has to learn how to dance with death and rebirth and destruction with a sense of grace. When they learn how to do that, that's when they really truly come into themselves and when they really step into their power. And when you think about it, with any kind of loss or with any kind of death comes grief. And grief is something that we feel very, 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 very deeply. And I really feel like grief is kind of like a Scorpio emotion, but when we go through that grieving process, there is a certain transformation that happens as well. And with that transformation, it comes transmutation and also alchemy. And, humor is also a great way to alchemize any kind of really, difficult emotion. And I don't think that is talked about enough when people talk about Scorpio. I always say, laughter is truly the best medicine. And it is a great way to kind of move through some of those difficult emotions. And so with Scorpio, they do have a great sense of humor usually. And, sometimes it's a darker sense of humor a lot of times. And it can be a little bit cynical, but it's a very dry and very perceptive and it cutting and it's usually a truthful sense of humor where they state things very matter of fact, but it's yeah, that is so true. But it's just with this natural inclination to the darker aspects of life, it's kind of they're able to see the full spectrum of the human experience very clearly. So sometimes with this draw to the dark, sometimes dangerous and more spooky aspects of life, it can lead them into some precarious situations. There might also be those times where they kind of give in to those darker thoughts and those darker compulsions, and so that can manifest as obsessive thinking and really like going down those thought spirals, or really like obsessive anything, and so that can manifest sometimes as like addictions. And all signs can have addictions, but like with Scorpio there is kind of like a stronger pull just because of like the obsessive quality that comes with Scorpio. And I think that goes back to Scorpio's Pluto rulership. But Scorpio is also like the fixed water sign, and so Scorpio can become very fixed on like one thing, and so it's kind of like you have to really pick your addictions wisely when you have Scorpio placements. Speaking from experience. Because with this like death and rebirth cycle, sometimes it can manifest as like very destructive if it's not channeled well, and so that can turn into self-destructive sometimes. And so that can be one of the challenges that Scorpio kind of faces, throughout the course of their life. But, the thing is that like Scorpio is not afraid of the dark, and they're not afraid of like what's hiding, and they're not afraid of like the mysteries and, what is considered like very deep. So Scorpio tends to actually embrace, like what many of us might reject out of fear or judgment or guilt or shame. Scorpio understands that like it's in that darkness where we truly transform, and that's where the magic happens. Like again, think about like the caterpillar in its cocoon. Like it's dark and scary in there, but it's aware that a transformation is happening, and it's actually pretty magical how that happens. So with that awareness, it makes Scorpio introspective and mysterious and very intuitive and psychic as fuck and extremely passionate. And its mission is to really like merge with others and penetrate like those psychological depths, because Scorpio isn't here to like frolic in the light, but it goes deep, and it is deep, and it expects you to dive deep with them as well. And so this is where we're being urged to again like embrace our shadows and face our shadows and get comfortable in the darkness and kind of go those places where most people kind of fear to embark. And so throughout the course of their life and through every kind of experience that they have, through like, diving deep and finding the deeper meaning in things, they might kind of find that they've developed a healing ability. And so through that, they can also give that to others who have also been through similar experiences. And then, they can help transform not only their personal life, but also the lives of others. And so it's kind of like with that superpower and that ability comes a deep level of empathy as well. So Scorpio's power is like mysterious and magnetic and seductive and stealthy, and it may not always be like very obvious on the surface, but you can trust that that power is bubbling just below the surface, and it's something that can be very much felt. And depending on how honest you're being with yourself, it can be kind of uncomfortable and a little bit intimidating to be perceived by a Scorpio, because they have that X-ray vision where it's kind of like they can just see right through you and see to like your core motivations. Really, it's like that iconic Scorpio stare that can just like pierce right through you. And so not everybody can handle Scorpio's intensity, but that's just kind of how you weed out the weaklings. And so these are like the human lie detectors and like the bullshit detectors, and it's because like they're psychic and intuitive as fuck. But it could also be that at like one point in their lives, because remember, Scorpio kind of gets drawn to those like darker aspects of life. And so at one point in their life, they were probably really good liars and manipulators themselves. And so, a lot of times Scorpio placements, they might go through a period or a phase in their life where they're kind of like secretive or deceitful. But then as they kind of like mature and evolve and grow out of that, it really turns into this amazing ability to be able to spot lies and deceits very easily. Kind of like it takes one to know one type of energy. And so I think I mentioned it briefly, but Scorpio is the fixed water sign of the zodiac. And so it's the third fixed sign, the first two being Taurus and Leo. And so fixed signs they tend to be known as being like stubborn, but they're really like stabilizing energies. And then it's also the second water sign. And so the first one is Cancer. And, water signs are emotional and intuitive. And so as a fixed sign, it's kind of like the height of that season. And so it's kind of like the height of fall season. I kind of think of it as like peak fall energy with Scorpio season. And, I think of like the leaves changing colors. And I also think it's no coincidence that Halloween, or Samhain for my fellow witches out there, falls in the middle of Scorpio season, because, Scorpio itself is kind of like spooky. Samhain is that holiday where we celebrate, our ancestors and, the people who have died. And It's also the time of year where we kind of face morality because, like, when you think about it, like 100, even like 200 years ago, it's kind of like Scorpio season really signaled the beginning of those darker and those colder months. And those could be the months where, you don't make it through. And so you really kind of have to face your morality during this time. And like I said, this is the time of year where we really start to notice like our light hours are decreasing more and more, and the night and the darkness is growing and getting longer. So as a fixed water sign, these are the emotions that like run deep, and they can be very unmoving and unshakable. And so Scorpio isn't like the water that it kind of like, flows around things like Pisces, or, crashes into them like Cancer. It's kind of like this water energy that absorbs, and it really dives deep, and it holds space for this intensity, and it finds power in what other people might find like way too intense. And like I said, there's a certain stubbornness that comes with all the fixed signs, but in Scorpio, it's like emotional stubbornness. And so Scorpio placements can hold a mean grudge because they will never forget how you made them feel. I think that's why Scorpio can kind of get that reputation sometimes for being like vengeful or revengeful or like malicious, but it's just because they will never be able to forget how you made them feel. And so they want you to feel the pain that you caused them, like, times 10. So as a fixed water sign, there's a few different ways that you can think about it, and, whatever works for you. But, the first way you could think about it is like the Scorpio waters are like a big deep lake. Like you could think of like the Great Lakes almost, where they go really, really deep. And so that's one way. And you could also think of it as like those deep, deep ocean waters as well, where it's like it's so far down that you can't see the bottom. And that's kind of like Scorpio energy. But then, for me, what I tend to think about is like, fixed water. So it's that immovable water. And so I tend to think of like ice, and more specifically like an iceberg. So going back to like that deep ocean water, I think that really speaks to their depth of feeling, and how like their level of perception goes so much deeper than what most people are even aware of. And so with this level of depth that Scorpio has, it's kind of like anything that is inauthentic or fake or superficial just kind of gives Scorpio the ick. And so these are the people that are able to notice like the subtle shifts in the undercurrents, because they're very tuned into the underlying emotions and feelings in a room, and they're very attuned to what's being said, but also more importantly what's not being said. And so they notice things that most other people would probably overlook. And it might even be like they actually kind of seek them out a little bit, because they're just kind of like looking for the secrets and looking for the mysteries, and opening closet doors and looking in rooms where they maybe shouldn't be. They're just very much drawn to like the mysteries and like the more taboo things. And that makes me think of like the detective and the researching side of Scorpio, where it's like they just want to get to the bottom of a mystery, or any kind of given situation. Like these are the people who tend to leave no stone unturned. And so Scorpio can be very like piercing and probing and penetrating, just like digging beneath the surface again. And so they can be very researching, and they like to go down the rabbit hole, and they will really obsess about something until they find a satisfactory answer, really. And so these are the people who know like just the right question to get the answer that they're looking for, because like I said, Scorpio is very introspective, and they can be very observant, and as they psychoanalyze themselves, they're also probably psychoanalyzing the people around them. And so with that observant quality, it's kind of like they're also very psychic as well. So it's kind of like it's all wrapped into one, and it all kind of feeds each other to create this Scorpio energy. And being a fixed sign, it's kind of like Scorpio really has that stamina to go all the way down that rabbit hole and just researching something to the absolute depths, because, they want to dig as deep as they possibly can and uncover the hidden meaning and the deeper truth behind, whatever it is that they're obsessing over during that time. Like really just like penetrating to the core. I'm getting like this visual of someone being interested in like understanding how the earth works, and so they're like digging all the way down to the mantle, like through the crust and the mantle and down to the core of the earth, just to try and understand how it works. And it's not like they'll obsess over just anything, like it has to be something that they're genuinely curious about and just like obsessed with again. But I think, being, it is a relational sign. It's a deepening of those Libra bonds. And so it tends to be like, they like to obsess over like how other people, think and feel as well. And they want to understand the people in their lives as well as like understanding themselves on a really deep level. But some other things that they might be obsessed with are probably like the mysteries and like the secrets and the occult, and just they like to dig deep, and they just want to get to the bottom of whatever it is. And then that makes me think of how Scorpio is like an iceberg, and it makes me think of like, there's so much more under the surface of a Scorpio than they let other people see. And, there's a lot to them, and they go a lot deeper than most people could even imagine. And that's why Scorpio can be so dangerous, yet so majestic, Think about what took out the Titanic, an iceberg. But it's like 90 to 95% of Scorpio is kind of like hidden, and it's underneath that water. And so it takes like getting to know them, and knowing the right keyword, or knowing like the secret entrance, or just like saying and doing the right thing in order for Scorpio to feel safe enough to open up to you and share like the other 90 to 95% of like their depth that they truly have. And so yes, Scorpio can be like ice, where it's like fixed water, or like solid and movable water where it doesn't flow very easily. But also think about like when you touch ice, how it hurts to touch it for too long, and it's intense. Like that's kind of Scorpio as well. And Scorpio can really give like a mean cold shoulder, and like it can give you freezer burn if you touch it for too long. But you can also like make tools out of ice. Like you can make like an ice pick, and you can really do some damage. But it can also protect and shield things like like an ice cave or an igloo. And so just like thinking about how deep an iceberg really truly goes, or you could also think about like those deep ocean waters again, where not many people really know what goes on down there, but we can speculate, but only a Scorpio really knows. But I think that this is where like the Scorpio empathy really comes from, where they just are able to understand like the full range of like the human emotions. And so when they're at the bottom of the ocean, they can kind of like see all from down there, but it also gets lonely down there. And so I found that a lot of Scorpio placements feel alienated in some way. And so it's kind of like, Scorpio lives in the underworld, and it's because like the underworld is its home. And so it's kind of like, that's its comfort zone. It's what they know. And it's like they grew up there. And so Scorpio is associated with like pain and death and sex and magic, and all of these things happen through Scorpio learning how to be vulnerable. So what Scorpio is kind of learning to reconcile over the course of their life is like those extremes of like complete power and control, and then just like absolute vulnerability. Because what they really want are like those close, intimate, deep connections with others. And, you have to be vulnerable in order to, build those deeper connections and those deeper bonds. And you have to be vulnerable, and, vulnerability is scary for Scorpio. And so it's kind of like they have to move through that fear, because everything you want is on the other side of fear. So this is what Scorpio is here to teach us, but it's kind of like those Scorpio placements are just kind of learning this lesson with a bit more intensity. But then once they are able to move through that fear, these people are able to create like very deep, meaningful, fulfilling bonds with people that, they do choose to let into their life, but it takes a lot. And so with this desire to like dive deep and dig deep and go beneath the surface and like pick up on the subtle energies of what's being said and what's not being said, it's kind of like they have this amazing level of intuition and perception that gives them the ability to be great healers and great psychologists and great therapists of all kind, really. And it's because they just have like this innate understanding of the drives and the motivations of others, being ruled by Mars and Pluto. And because of their level of depth, not as many people go as deep as Scorpio can. And so it's kind of like that saying where, people can only meet you as deep as you've met yourself. And so Scorpio has this ability to meet most people at a level of depth that like other people either can't or are unwilling to. Like Scorpio will go there because they can handle the intensity, they come from the underworld, and so they've seen it all kind of. So if you have a Scorpio in your life that you're close to, these are the people that you can turn to about anything, and it's kind of like they won't judge you because they've seen and done it all, and it's kind of like, they'll sit there with you. So again, Scorpio is fixed water, and water is like emotion and memory, and Cancer is kind of like the purest form of that. But with Scorpio, it's kind of like there's more of a controlled element to it. And so it's kind of like controlled memory and controlled emotion and controlled intuition. And so these Scorpio emotions are kind of like a super deep well where it's like you really can't see the bottom of them. And so they have these very deep and intense and strong emotions, and they just feel everything so deeply and so intensely. It's kind of like, there's this underlying current that everyone feels, but Scorpio feels it like times 100. And a lot of that emotion is just kind of like buried under the surface of the water. And so it's kind of like waiting and sustaining for the right moment to express that emotion. It's kind of like, like they're like a trapdoor spider where it's like they burrow under the ground and then they wait for the right moment to either attack or express their emotions. And, they are the Scorpion after all. And it's kind of interesting that like both Cancer and Scorpio are they have the exoskeletons of the zodiac, being the crab and the scorpion. But, basically, Scorpios, they really don't like to share how they're thinking or feeling very often or with very many people, because there has to be a certain level of trust established. And for Scorpio, it takes a long time for them to like feel like they can trust someone. And also they're probably worried that like you won't be able to handle the intensity and the depth of like what they think and feel. Like I think if we could read a Scorpio's mind, like we'd all probably be a little scared. So you really have to like earn your place into a Scorpio's life, and they'll make you work hard for it. They're probably testing you right now, and they like to set little traps to see if you'll fall for it kind of energy. Like almost imagine that you're like peeling an onion, and that onion is the Scorpio, where it's kind of like there's layer after layer after layer that they let you see, but you have to have the right tools, and you have to say and do the right things, and then also along the way the onion might like spray you and make you cry. But it just stems from like this space of vulnerability and just like, how deeply they feel, and they don't want to get hurt. So Scorpio can be very calculating and strategic in that way, where they can really like play the long game, where they can be like good poker players, and they've got a good poker face, but they can also be really good chess players, where they spend like years and years planning and plotting before doing like their sneak attack and attacking when the person is least expecting it kind of energy. And it's kind of like Scorpio likes to hold its cards really close to its chest, unless it like serves them in some way to share a little bit of information, or like just enough of information in order to like lead someone in a direction where they want them to go. And so they can be manipulative in that way, but again, like all signs can be manipulative, but maybe just don't wrong a Scorpio and they won't hold a grudge against you, and then you won't be wondering for years and years if they're like hiding down the street waiting to attack. But it's just because like when they are betrayed or they feel like their trust is taken advantage of, they feel very hurt and they feel let down, and they will never forget that. It's fixed water. So if you're like just meeting a Scorpio, they tend to be like pretty suspicious at first, but it's just because like you're guilty until proven innocent with Scorpio. Because they want to be like 100% certain that they can trust this person and that this person isn't going to hurt them, because they really, really, really don't like to feel vulnerable. But it's because of like this sensitivity and this intensity that Scorpios tend to be a little bit more private than the other signs, because they can be more self-protective because they're very emotional and sensitive, and because of the sensitivity, throughout their life they probably had to develop some kind of self-protective armor to kind of keep them safe and protect that sensitivity and that softness. And so again, you really have to like earn a Scorpio's trust, and if you're doing so in a weird like manipulative way, they're gonna see right through that, and you've already failed the test. But if you're just like doing so and you're coming from like a space of emotional authenticity, and you're slowly taking the time to get to know them and let them get to know you, and you don't do them dirty or you don't lie to them. Lying is a big thing with Scorpio. But yeah, if you like don't do them wrong in any kind of way, then eventually a Scorpio will warm up to you and slowly start to let you in. But it does take a while, Scorpio isn't that kind of sign that's gonna like welcome you with wide open arms, it's kind of like it takes a while, and it's kind of like there's almost a prickliness with Scorpio, and so it's kind of like, that's what weeds out the weaklings who, can't hang with them and can't handle their level of intensity. But once you have a Scorpio in your corner, it tends to be for life. And once you know a Scorpio, then you know how loving and caring and sensitive and passionate and loyal these people are. And these are the people who can and will kind of like go through your dark night of the soul with you, or they'll sit with you at your rock bottom moment, because they know like in those moments of darkness that's where really true beautiful transformation happens, like I said earlier, and they themselves have probably been there. And so it's like these people are the people who can sit in those depths with you, and they're like, I can take it and we'll make it out of this together, and they can handle the intensity. And it's like, it's not like they'll do the hard work for you or they'll do the healing work for you, but they'll be there with you and they'll hold your hand through it, and if they care about you in any type of way. And that's why Scorpios make great healers and therapists. But you really, really don't want to fuck over a Scorpio in any type of way, because you can unearn that trust and you can unearn that loyalty. And, especially if you take that loyalty for granted, because, they can be very shrewd and discerning when, like choosing who to allow into their lives. And, that's why they like to probably keep their circle small. And if you wrong a Scorpio, they're never going to forget it. And they will use that Scorpio stinger and attack when you least expect it. And a Scorpio sting is not like, a finger prick, it's something that burns and like you get those phantom pains as well. And so it's kind of like a lasting, burning, stinging feeling that you'll feel for the rest of your life. I always say with my Scorpio Venus, the things that I have released and let go of all have my claw marks on them, because you won't be forgetting me anytime soon. And that makes me think of the Mars-Pluto dual rulership over Scorpio, where, Mars is the traditional ruler and now Pluto is the more modern day ruler. I really see how both of them influence Scorpio though. So being ruled by both Mars and Pluto, it's kind of like Scorpio carries like this double edge where it's like this action, but then there's also destruction and this will to assert yourself, but also like a regeneration, transformative quality. And so Mars's rulership kind of shows Scorpio's like passion and leadership abilities and their deep motivation, and also like the sexual side of Scorpio, and Scorpio's draw to danger as well, I think. And it really shows like the raw drive and determination and stamina that Scorpio represents as well. Like they are really able to have like this super focused, like almost single-minded stamina where they're just able to like go full force and not waste any energy and really like see things all the way through. I really feel like Mars's rulership over Aries is kind of like the more traditional way that you think about Mars being like, the athlete or like the captain or just like a natural leader, because people just like follow Aries because he seems to know what he's doing. And Aries is brave, like almost sometimes in a foolish way, but like also it's valiant and it has those instincts, but it just doesn't quite have like the life experience that Scorpio does, because Aries is like the newborn of the zodiac, and now we're in the 8th sign, so it's kind of like we've experienced all of these signs up until now. And so Aries is like this sheer force and this will to kind of get through just because I want to kind of energy. Whereas Scorpio is kind of like, let's watch and let's wait and let's observe and let's listen before acting. And so it's kind of like got this real stealthy quality again. And it's kind of like, that calculating and strategic quality. And so Mars's rulership in Aries is kind of like the captain on the battlefield, whereas Scorpio is kind of like the general in the back room, kind of moving those chess pieces around, or, it's kind of like the assassin where it's able to like move in silence and do those sneak attacks where you don't like hear them or see them, just like all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're on the ground. And because they are incredibly strategic, they know that there's a time and a place to watch and wait and listen, and then there's also a time for taking action. And also there's a very like psychic and intuitive quality to Scorpio where it's like, they know their opponent's weaknesses and they know just the right time to exploit those weaknesses. And it's probably because, at some point in their life, Scorpio has experienced pain and loss and grief and fear and death, and so it's kind of like it's facing those battles again after resurrecting itself from the dead, and it's like, I've already lost this battle before and I'm never going to lose again type of energy. And so it's kind of like Scorpio's just like that seething, sustained emotion, just like simmering below the surface. And so it has this level of courage where, they've faced danger before and they've been burned before, and so they don't want to do that again. And so now they want revenge. And so Scorpio does have this sense of vengeance where, they want to avenge something. And so where Aries is more like bold and impulsive, Scorpio is more like calculated. And so to do this, it takes strategy. And so they're going to be very calculated in order to do this. And, they have to have patience and persistence and this ability to watch and observe and wait and listen again. And so they want to be able to like confuse their opponent almost. And then with like that Pluto rulership of it all, Pluto is that planet of deep transformation and evolution and power and control and obsession. So of course it rules over Scorpio. And Pluto really gives Scorpio that power and that magnetism and that sense of like depth as well, and that ability to dive beneath the surface and just, that instinct to transform and transmute and alchemize. And remember, those Scorpio waters are like the deep oceans and like the hidden wells of emotion. And so it's kind of like where other signs might try to avoid it and resist that feeling, it's like Scorpio just naturally dives right into. And so really think about like Pluto's orbit. You know, it takes like 248 years to completely orbit around the sun, and so it's got a long orbit, and so it's kind of like it helps Scorpio play the long game. It's kind of like, I remember what you did and I'm bringing it back eventually. So Pluto is that planet that brings these unavoidable transformations, and it's kind of like, it can be like an avalanche sometimes where it's like you can feel it coming and there's no stopping it, and the more you resist it, it's kind of like the more difficult it gets. But Pluto really brings like this metamorphosis quality again, where you're transforming and you're evolving from a cellular level, and so it also brings a transcendence after this transformation. And so I really feel like Pluto gives Scorpio this quality of like almost like a redemption arc, where it's like you want to take your power back, and it's almost like this quality of like what comes around goes around, you know? And Pluto transits, you know, think about them. They can really bring those like dark nights of the soul, or like even those rock bottom moments. And, you know, it's kind of like where you face the void a little bit and you still come back. And, you know, think about the stairwell to, you know, the underworld. That's a long walk down. And so you've walked your way down and you've walked your way back up, and, you know, you can do it again and again if you need to, type of energy. And with Pluto, it really helps Scorpio dive deep again and kind of get to the deeper psychological truths and really confront what others would rather try to suppress or avoid. And Scorpio doesn't do that. And it really actually demands authenticity, and it refuses to live life on the surface. And that's what gives Scorpio like such a powerful magnetism, where it's like that's where its power lies. And then, of course, we have to talk about the symbol that represents Scorpio, or, you know, Scorpio in the sky, or the Zodiac, and it's the Scorpion. And, you know, what does the Scorpion have? It has its own built-in exterior armor, being its exoskeleton, and it also has its weapon attached, ready for battle, you know, being its tail, that's the stinger. And so it enters most situations almost suspiciously, like, you know, they're expecting to be attacked, and so they just come fully prepared and fully armored. Like, that's why, like, for example, if you meet like a Scorpio rising, you know, they're kind of notorious for having that resting bitch face, and so you might kind of expect for them to be intimidating or scary or whatever, but then once you get to know them, you know, they're usually pretty sweet. But it might just be that they've been through a lot in their life and they've experienced a lot, and so they've kind of acquired the resting bitch face over the years or whatever. And so yes, Scorpio is the Scorpion in the Zodiac, but according to like, you know, Alan Oken and some other evolutionary astrologers out there, Scorpio has 3 evolutionary symbols or stages of consciousness. And that first one is the Scorpion. So like I've been talking about, where they can be very like self-protective and defensive, and, you know, nothing wrong with that. That's just like that first stage of Scorpio, where it might use its stinger when it feels threatened. And so, you know, this is where Scorpio learns lessons in boundaries and survival and self-preservation. And, you know, once it learns actually not to sting at any given opportunity, and it really holds on to that venom or that poison, that's where the transformation begins. And then that next stage is the eagle, and that's actually how Scorpio has been depicted in a lot of medieval and ancient Greek texts, where Scorpio will kind of begin to rise above and really see things from this higher perspective and a higher vantage point. And, you know, this level is less attached to control and kind of more aware of the higher truth, or, you know, the deeper truth. And then Scorpio's final stage of evolution is like, you know, the phoenix rising from the ashes, or in some cases, people consider it to be the dove, where Scorpio has gone through a total transformation at that point. And so, you know, this is kind of like where this person has gone through plenty of dark nights of the soul, and it's kind of like the soul that's died 1,000 times and emerged wiser each time. And so this is the Scorpio who understands that power is something internal and something that comes from within, and not something to be wielded over others, and, you know, not trying to control others as well. And so the Scorpio evolution is about mastering power, first through confrontation and then through surrender. And so I know this has been a lot to take in, and there's a lot of depth that comes with Scorpio, so let's just briefly bring it back to basics real quick. And so first and foremost, Scorpio is the fixed water sign of the Zodiac. So it's like sustained emotions and fixed emotions, or stubborn emotions. And so Scorpio sustains emotional focus with intensity. You know, where Cancer kind of nurtures and Pisces is more flowy. It's kind of like Scorpio penetrates and it goes deep and it dives deep, and it's the deep diver of the zodiac, and it's really unafraid of darkness because it knows that's where true transformation happens. And with that fixed water, again, you can think of like a dark lake, like the Great Lakes, or you could think about like the deep ocean waters, like where it's dark and mysterious down there. Or you could also think of, the iceberg, where it's like, we only get to see like 10% of a Scorpio and the rest is hidden underneath, where it just goes so deep, And so it's like what's beneath the surface isn't visible at first glance, but it's powerful and it's there. So Scorpio's fixed nature really gives it this emotional endurance and a psychic depth. And so it really holds on to those emotions, sometimes creating grudges and wanting to seek vengeance and revenge. But then once it does finally like let go and release, it's a total release. There's no halfway healing here with Scorpio. It's kind of like all or nothing. It's that extreme sign. And so it either feels nothing or it feels everything. And it's a sign that is ruled by Mars and Pluto. And so we just talked about this a little bit, but Mars is the traditional ruler, and so it gives Scorpio that drive and courage and passion, and it teaches Scorpio to really act decisively, but also strategically. Unlike Aries, like direct fire, it's kind of like a direct shot. Scorpio's version of Mars is kind of like slow burning, and it's precise but extremely, extremely calculated. And again, playing the long game. It's like this quiet intensity that knows when to strike, but also when to hold back and when to wait and observe and plan and strategize. Mars also gives Scorpio, again, this like raw passion and this drive to survive and win at all costs. And then Pluto, being the modern ruler, it just kind of represents the transformative side of Scorpio. And it's kind of like, that underworld and the deep, dark, intense side of Scorpio, and, the alchemy as well, where it's like, this rebirth quality. It really helps Scorpio to embrace this like regenerative quality. I really feel like Pluto teaches Scorpio the inevitability of endings, like, it's like that death and rebirth cycle. And so Pluto isn't exactly here to make Scorpio's life easy, but it's here to make it real and help make it more fulfilling. Some things like rotten, it's like Pluto makes sure to expose that and helps us kind of discard it. But if something's sacred, then Pluto guards it very fiercely. And then we just talked about the symbolism and the mythology of, the scorpion in the sky. We just covered that, so I won't go over it again. But that also brings me to the glyph and how it's that M with like that little pointy stinger on the end, and that actually represents the scorpion stinger. Now let's talk about some of the strengths and potential challenges that might arise for these Scorpio placements. And so at its best, Scorpio is devoted and loyal, and it's like that loyalty is unwavering. Like these are the people that will bury a body for you and then take that secret to the grave. These are the secret keepers, really. They can handle anything, and like there's nothing that a Scorpio can't handle. It's kind of like they're fearless in that way. They're also amazing healers, and like not just like, they can heal a little wound or whatever, but like this like soul deep emotional healing. Like I always think of shamanic healing when I think of Scorpio, where it's like, it happens on like a spiritual level. They're also incredibly resilient, where it's kind of like they will just take the shit that is handed to them and absorb it and transmute it and then just keep going. Again, they're the alchemizers and the transmuters, like I've been talking about like this whole hour. They're also kind of like the magician in tarot, where they're just incredible manifestors, where it's like they want something, then it's like they will go full force trying to get whatever it is that they want, and they won't give up. They're also like the change agents, where they're just like so incredibly powerful and they can create these enormous waves of change. They're also incredibly courageous, where it's like, they've faced the shadows, they've faced the darkness, and they've faced their fears, and then they teach us to face our own fears and our own shadows and face our own darknesses, whatever it might be. And they help us realize the power in that integration, because when you can accept and embrace those shadows, and no matter what anyone says, they can't hold that shadow over you. And so they might try to control you or blackmail you or whatever, but once you've embraced and integrated your shadow, it's kind of like no one can hold that over you. And now, like every sign, Scorpio also has its shadowy or under-resourced or challenging qualities. And so some of those might be, they can be prone to jealousy and possessiveness, and they can come across as being controlling, but it really stems from this fear of betrayal. And they can be distrustful because of that. And so they can also be prone to like secrecy or even like manipulation, where, they can play a mean mind game, or they can be like masterful in it. And so it can be almost like psychological warfare. Like a Scorpio is not someone that you want to do wrong or someone that you want as an enemy. Like you really want Scorpio as an ally, because they will help you figure out like the entire puzzle, and they'll help you kind of like strategize a game plan to help you win. Because as an enemy, like, they kind of like to play with their food, and they don't give a fuck who you are. So they can also be prone to like extreme suspicion because they're not trusting of others, and that can almost lead to lean into paranoia sometimes. And also like an unhealthy expression of Scorpio, or an unhealed or under-resourced Scorpio, is that they tend to sometimes over-identify with their wounds. And so that's why they can sometimes be like the emotionally unavailable partner, because, they want to almost play out that cycle again and again unconsciously. Because, when they're so identified with their wounds, it's like they almost subconsciously want to get hurt again. Not like I'm speaking from experience or anything. And so it can almost manifest as a form of self-sabotage, because they're just like over-identifying with their wound, and, always like, like let's say their wound is like they got cheated on, and so they're kind of like identified with being the person who always gets cheated on or whatever. And so then what happens is that wound just becomes a part of their identity. And so that's just like the unhealed version of Scorpio. And so once they do the work, hopefully they heal that. Sometimes an unhealed Scorpio also feels like, they almost have to suffer in order to be tapped into the depths of life and like the depths of their feeling. Because Scorpio really doesn't want to live like a superficial or frivolous life. They want to be in a deeply meaningful, potent life, and one that's gritty and gory, and one that's tough and challenging. Because Scorpio kind of loves a challenge. So they can end up in situations that create more difficulty, or it's like, they create more difficulty in their lives for themselves, just wanting to kind of experience life at that depth. And so every Scorpio life path revolves around these themes of transformation, and it's about dying to an old identity and rising renewed. It's like that phoenix rising from the ashes. So this might play out through like crisis or loss or profound emotional change, but the pattern is always the same, where the more they surrender to the transformation, the more powerful they become. And so Scorpio's purpose here is to transform through these crises, and transform through change, and transform and change through every experience that they have. They're really here to teach us transformation and to help us heal through these like deeper emotional truths, and to really master the art of regeneration, and to teach us that, endings are never actually the end, but they are just portals to a new beginning. And so the Scorpio wisdom is not exactly easy, but it really teaches us to live fully. And so in order to live a full life, you have to die to what's no longer true and authentic. And it contains that energy of the phoenix again, destroying the illusions and reclaiming power and embracing the mystery of life itself. And so if you have strong Scorpio placements in your chart, then your kind of message for this lifetime is that you are not meant to play small, but you are meant to transform over and over again, and really teach transformation and grow and evolve through every experience that you have. And that is your way to teach that healing. It's not like you have to do the healing work for others, but you kind of lead by example. And so if you are a Scorpio, or if you have strong Scorpio in your chart, then be sure to comment down below how all of this resonated and what resonated the most. And yeah, this has been my Scorpio 101 video, and I dove really deep, and I couldn't stop talking, I guess. So take a moment to sit with the energy and observe the energy around you, because that's how you really learn the astrology and embody the astrology. And then ask yourself what you're ready to shed during this Scorpio season, and then what are you ready to rise into? But yeah, I think that is all I've got to say for now. I said a lot, but if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and yeah, until next time, love you, bye!